Hi guys, welcome to the 7th episode of the Healing Haley Show. If you're here again, thank you for being here and thank you for showing up for yourself. So today we're going to be talking about the fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment. This is the attachment style that I identify with the most, so naturally I've been avoiding this video. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a licensed professional. I'm just a girl who's sharing her story in hopes that it can help a few people along the way. If you are looking for that licensed or professional help, then definitely go seek it elsewhere. But if you want to stay and keep listening, as I said, today we're talking about the third insecure attachment style. So before we get into it, like this video, subscribe, hit all the buttons, drop all the comments. That stuff really helps me out, and I love hearing about what people are going through. So reach out anytime. My name's Haley Foreman. I'm going to be your host. So like I said, let's get into it. Fearful avoidance. This is the third insecure attachment style, as I said. So the previous episodes were about anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. Fearful avoidant attachment is a combination of both of those attachments. So hence the name disorganized. You attach in anxious and avoidant ways all at the same time. In the previous episodes, I spoke about the signs and symptoms of each attachment, and I spoke about it in childhood. So definitely go watch those videos if you haven't watched them. If you or anyone in your life exhibits, fearful avoidant tendencies, then it's really necessary to go watch those videos. It's necessary on a whole, but especially if you're watching this video for that reason, then definitely go back and watch those other videos, because it will help you to understand this one a bit more. And I'm also not going to go back through those things because I just don't have enough time in these videos, because I try to stay around the 35-minute mark, and there's quite a lot to talk about in fearful avoidance. So let's jump right into it. I'll just do a really quick part about how it can present in childhood, but I'm not going to get too deep into that because, as I said, it's in the previous videos. So specifically fearful avoidance, you can have a child who is aimless or has no real intention, like kind of just goes with the flow, like what everyone else is doing, like kind of lacking that self-worth and purpose. Or you can have a kid who is really fearful of you or fearful of their caregiver, or is aggressive of their caregiver, aggressive towards their caregiver. One other thing that I think really signifies fearful avoidance is, fearful avoidant people don't want to be intimate with anyone, and yet they desperately crave that closeness and affection at the same time. So for me as a kid, I felt really unsafe with my parents, and I think I kind of had a very watered down, dull version of my personality when I was with my parents. And then when I was with friends, and then later on in life with partners, like I was much more outgoing and talkative, and just kind of like funny and weird, like those parts of my personalities would show up. So I think that's definitely something to look out for. If you find that your kid is really different around you than they are with their friends, or they're like more intimate with their friends, then you might need to start looking at that and what that means, and why they don't feel as safe being vulnerable with you, because yes, to some degree, as kids get older, maybe in that kind of teenage phase of life, yeah, sometimes kids start to, they're getting to a point of like wanting that independence from their parents, but that's not what I'm talking about. Like, this is something like a little bit different. And, if this is resonating with you, like you remember feeling this way as a kid, or you even feel that way now, where you really prioritize your friendships and your relationships like above everything else. And not to say that that's a bad thing, but if you find that you are doing that, then you probably need to look back on your childhood and think like, was I like really fearful of my caregiver? Did I feel like unsafe with them? Did I feel like I couldn't really trust them? And start thinking through those feelings. So now that we kind of skimmed over that really quickly, let's jump into the signs in adulthood, because there's quite a few. Number one, you sometimes find yourself missing your partner, but when you finally see them, you pick fights. So for me, I'm definitely guilty of this. Before I worked through these things, and before I knew what was happening with me emotionally, like this was an issue, because I was often in relationships with avoidant people. So they weren't expressing themselves after a while. Like, when the relationship or the friendship got very close and very very intimate or very vulnerable, then they started to pull away and wouldn't really express how they felt. And that can create this dynamic, especially with someone who leans anxious. So like I said, I have a lot of anxious tendencies. What happens when you're in that space where you feel unsafe because you don't know how the other person feels, and that's making you really anxious? You now subconsciously pick a fight, because if you pick a fight, then usually you'll get something out of them. Like they'll say something, even to just stop the fight or something, like not necessarily a full on fight, but like an argument, like it will get chaotic in that way, because the other person is just like giving you nothing. And a secure person in that dynamic would have just said, like, you're not looking for someone to fill those gaps in you anymore. Like now I've gone through this process of growth and healing. And even though that's a lifelong process, I've gotten to a place where like I can give myself that love that I was searching for in other people. Like I don't need that from someone else, or I don't think I can find it in someone else. Whereas before I really thought that, like I really had that mindset that, someone else was going to save me and like fill all these holes or these gaps, but that's not going to happen, So once you get to a place of realizing that and connecting with yourself and your purpose and your just the universal love around you, then you don't feel that anymore. So that is a big part of not craving that dynamic anymore. Or I think it's just like, of course, there can be people who work on their attachment styles without any aspect of spirituality, but I just think it's all tied together. So it definitely enhances your chances of really getting through that attachment and securing your attachment and becoming more mature, because you feel really fulfilled and like at peace with that love within yourself. So like I was doing this, and I was doing it subconsciously, and I just want to state that really clearly, because I wasn't conscious of the fact that like this person isn't telling me what I want to hear or need to hear or whatever. So I'm going to pick a fight with them so that I can hear something. Like, that's not what's happening in your brain. Like, in your brain, you're literally just like not okay, don't feel safe. You're like, what the heck is going on? Why won't you tell me how you feel? And usually that person is going through their own things, which we'll talk about as time goes on. Number 2, you often attempt to hide your feelings, but you can't seem to keep them to yourself. You're trying to hide your feelings to avoid seeming clingy, or to avoid conflict, or to avoid being vulnerable. And then what ends up happening is, because you're bottling up all those feelings, it just ends up coming out in another way. And usually the way that it comes out is not constructive and unhealthy. And then if you had just expressed yourself in a in a calm, like rational, healthy way, you wouldn't have appeared clingy to someone, or you wouldn't have been coming off like what you thought you were going to come off like. But now that you've bottled it up and expressed it in this way, you actually are coming off in that way now. So now that person does think that this is kind of clingy, or this is kind of unhealthy behavior. And this is going to kind of segue into the next symptom, which is fearful avoidant people often create self-fulfilling prophecies and often sabotage relationships. And the way that you do that is because, things happen to you as a kid. So let's say, for example, when you expressed yourself, that like you just expressing your feelings was met with anger. So now you just do not feel safe to express your feelings. So what you do now is you bring that from your past into your relationship now. And you think to yourself, if I tell someone how I really feel, they're going to be angry at me. So I can't tell them how I really feel. And then what ends up happening is, that person's trying to communicate with you and understand what's going on, because they've probably picked up on some signals or some, like reactions, or maybe if you're being passive aggressive, or like they've picked up on some kind of cue probably, or they've even picked up on the fact that, you're saying you're fine, but everything else really is pointing to the fact that you're not fine. And then they try and communicate with you, and you don't tell them the truth. And then over time, what happens is that creates this anxiety within someone, or frustration within someone. And honestly, no matter how secure or mature that person is, it's going to be a natural reaction to be very frustrated by that in a friendship or a partnership. And obviously, that frustration or anxiety or anger will be released to a more mature degree. But still, those are normal feelings that you have. And expressing anger and frustration is okay. And secure people know that. So what's going to happen in that situation now is the secure person, or whomever, your partner, is going to express frustration about the fact that you're not communicating. Because that's going to stagnate the process of healing whatever has gone on in your relationship. Now you're going to perceive that frustration as the person being mad at you about you expressing yourself. And now you've just completely projected your feelings into the relationship, created this self-fulfilling prophecy where you're like, see, I knew they were going to get upset. But in reality, they're not upset about what you think they're upset about. They're upset because you're not expressing yourself. You're not saying how you feel. And I mean, after a while, that's going to weigh on anyone. So you have to really start like checking yourself and acknowledging these things and wondering am I doing this? Like, am I sitting here thinking that the other person, or the other persons, because you've probably done it in several relationships, like the other people really get mad at me when I express myself, or don't care when I express myself, or ignore me, or neglect me, or guilt me? Have they really done that? And really start being honest with yourself. And then kind of to jump into the next one, you tend to take everything your partner does very personally. So this kind of ties in the same way. Once again, you're projecting your own feelings into someone else's feelings. So imagine you're in a dynamic where you're with your friend and you're saying, hey, what you did really made me feel this way, and I was wondering if we could talk about it. Okay, so I'm not a good enough friend then. When you're met back with that, when you're met back with someone personalizing things like that, it can just be really destructive to a relationship, because The person wasn't trying to say that you're not good enough. They weren't making it about you. They were just saying, hey, this is causing this situation in our connection, and it's not healthy. Can we work on it? Can we figure out why it's happening? Can we move through it? But because you've personalized it so much, now, the next time that person needs to speak to you, they're going to have this feeling of like, I can't tell the person how I feel because they're just going to feel guilty. And, and then sometimes if you're not like a really secure, mature person, like you may end up lying in that situation. Because you don't, like, if you express yourself and you know that you're going to express yourself to someone and that's going to make the other person feel bad or feel guilty, you're not going to be expressing yourself anymore. And what's really ironic is I was in a relationship with someone who did this, and they specifically felt that way as a kid, that their parent did that to them. That if they expressed themselves, that they felt that their parent made them feel guilty about it. I'm like, you're doing the same thing. And it's just not quite in the same way. It's this kind of like indirect roundabout way. But you have to get really real with yourself about the fact that that's still what you're doing though. It can be really hard to look at yourself and identify all of these flaws, and it like reveals some unflattering things about yourself. But you're a person just like anyone else. Once again, these things happen to you as a kid. You didn't ask for them. And, this is the hand you were dealt. So you just make do. It's totally fine to acknowledge the feelings, but you also have to move through them and start doing better. Because really and truly, if you really identify with the fact that you're so upset about the fact that this happened to you as a kid, or you went through this as a kid, that should mean that you never want it to happen to anyone else. You never want to continue projecting that into other connections and relationships. So if you're sitting here like playing the victim about what has happened to you, just make sure you're also changing your life, because those two things can't exist at once. And they, people often are in that stage of like, oh, boo-hoo, poor me. And you guys have, if you've been watching these episodes, you know that I think it's really hard to acknowledge these things, and it's really hard to move through those feelings. And I think all of your feelings around situations in your childhood are valid. But I just think at the end of the day, you have to say, okay, this is what happened. I didn't ask for it. I had no control over it happening to me. I have compassion and understanding towards those people. And now I'm going to stop doing that. And that's literally it. Like, there's nothing more. If you're extra sad some days or extra angry some days, like, that's okay. It's okay. But it's not okay to just like sit there and sit in those feelings. Like, you have to continually keep moving through those feelings. And if things come up, you move through them. And that's it. So let's jump into the next one. You have no idea how to get your needs met. You might not even really understand what your needs are until they are overwhelming. So for me, I could not identify the fact that, being in dynamics that were causing me like a lot of emotional pain were causing me to also engage in unhealthy, like compulsive behaviors. So, I'll get into that at a later point. I don't really like to call it addiction, because I just think the word addiction is really misleading. But, I like dove deep into stuff because I could not confront that emotional pain. And for me personally, I didn't really know that it existed. Like, I was just kind of, like, I thought I was completely okay. and I really wasn't okay. And, finally confronting that and working through that has been a relief. It's been hard and it's been really difficult, but it ultimately, it's been great, and it's been a relief. But the journey itself it can be tough. But as I said, I had no real understanding of having my needs met, because, growing up in a situation where I had to constantly meet other people's needs to feel safe. I had to constantly feel is my mom okay? How can I make this situation okay for her? Because I need her to be okay. Because if she's not okay, how am I going to be okay? And subconsciously that's happening. So, I would just have times where my mom would come home from work and she wasn't really very talkative. She just kind of walked into the house, and then she was sighing a lot and slamming cupboard doors. And she even at one point put this magnet on the fridge that said, no one notices what I do until I don't do it. And I remember thinking haha, that's so funny. It's a funny joke. And my dad was like, oh, did you guys see the magnet that your mom put on the fridge? And I'm just thinking back to myself, that is such an immature thing to do. Number one, it's extremely passive aggressive. And that is just a very small way of me showing you what happened in my childhood. Never knowing what was going on and being what? What do you mean? No one cares about what you do. All of a sudden now you're oh, she's angry? I thought that was a joke. And now you're shuffling to try and figure that out. Just because that person won't express how they feel to you. So now you can understand why, for me personally, being in a space where I don't know how another person feels makes me feel incredibly unsafe. And it makes me emotional. I'm starting to kind of cry now, because thinking about those feelings is difficult. You just go right back to, being in those spaces. And even though, no one's doing these things on purpose. My mom wasn't doing these things on purpose. She was in her own emotional pain. Other people in my life were in their own emotional pain. I'm never blaming another person. And I think it's absolutely okay that other people are going through these things. You just have to work on it. You just have to literally start working on it. That's all. But, it does affect other people. So I've done things that have affected other people and really hurt other people. So, it goes around. You're not alone in it. Other people have hurt you, I'm sure, and you've hurt other people, I'm sure. That is a very normal thing that we just all have to start acknowledging and moving through so that we can all stop. But anyway, like I said, I was constantly shifting and changing to meet her needs because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make it okay. So now being in situations where I feel that pain again, I'm trying to meet other people's needs, but I'm not recognizing that my own aren't being met, and I'm in this severe emotional pain. That seemed really safe to me. That seemed really, or it just seemed really comfortable to me. It didn't seem like it was this thing that was wrong, even though everything outside of me was showing me, Haley, something is wrong. I still couldn't feel it within myself. I still didn't have that awareness because I was so disconnected from my own needs. So this is why fearful avoidance is the worst attachment style. It's the hardest one to go through because it's usually rooted in trauma. And trauma doesn't have to be this like specific event. Like it can be tons of microaggressions over time. It can also be specific events. Like it can also be like abuse, or like watching your caregiver abuse someone else, or, like an actual traumatic event like grief, or, physical or mental or verbal abuse. For sure. It can be all of those things too. But, when I was in these spaces again of kind of feeling that same way I felt as a kid, now I'm like running to these compulsive behaviors, or, burying my feelings in food, and like food really filling that gap of like loneliness in me. And for fearful avoidant people, like you tend to struggle with addiction or compulsive behaviors. That's like a pretty normal thing. For this reason, and that's why I'm like sticking here for so long, because I really want people to understand that usually it's rooted in this, the fact that you do not know what your needs are, so you can't meet them. So you're constantly getting yourself into situations where you are actually not okay. And it's very hard for you to recognize that you're not okay, because you don't know what being okay even means. Like you're only worried about other people being okay. You're not really worried about yourself. So just be really careful about that. Be really careful about recognizing those situations, and trying to really ask yourself, like, is everything in my life going the way I want it to? And what are the areas where it's not going the way I want it to? Or like for me specifically, when I was in relationships that, were getting to that point of the other person wasn't talking to me, the other person wasn't sharing how they felt, and then I was feeling this feeling again of like, I don't know how you feel, and and that's making me feel unsafe, then like you have to start recognizing what's happening at that point. And for me, it was multiple relationships that happened, and I can look back at when that started happening, and when I started gaining weight, or when I started like having other like addictive behaviors in my life. And as soon as I'm out of the relationship, I don't have it at all. And now I've gotten to another place where, like I said, I've done this healing and growth work and really processed it all, so I won't get back into that situation again, because I've really worked through it, But before, it's like you would be in that situation, and when you were out of it, you would think, oh, it was just that situation. But it wasn't. Like, you are also being attracted to those situations to show you aspects of yourself that need more love. So now you have to start looking at your life in that way of like, are things blowing up in my life at this point, or that stage, and start looking at like, what is it showing me? Because usually it's directing you back towards that love. And if you can truly like trust that and believe that, you will find your way. So we've spoken about a lot of those signs in adulthood. Now let's start talking about the 5 types of fearful avoidant, because I think I did said that there are also types of fearful avoidant. So there's a volatile fearful avoidant, which means that, usually a volatile fearful avoidant has been through a lot of trauma. They tend to be very critical. They threaten relationships a lot. They're angry and aggressive. And honestly, that was me in those spaces that I was telling you about, where I was like in a lot of emotional pain. Like, I was that way. So, it wasn't easy to be with me at that point. And I really understand that. Like, I do for the people that I dated. Even though the dynamic of the relationship was really causing this to surface, still, like, It can't be easy to be with someone who's like existing in this state. And for a long time, I was like really in that like state of survival, and acting this way to protect myself, or like I thought I was protecting myself. You can have an internal fearful avoidant who is the same as a volatile avoidant, except they're much better at suppressing their expressions. And that usually comes from the fact that anger wasn't okay to be expressed as a child. So they still feel all these feelings. They still feel all this rage and like very kind of chaotic feelings, but it's all under the surface. So we kind of spoke about that a little bit before, about being in a situation where expressing anger isn't okay. And that can be really destructive. So the third one is a control-oriented fearful avoidant. So these people tend to be very high achieving. You feel control until you're in a relationship, and then you feel out of control. And you're always trying to attain this like high level of perfectionism. And it's usually because mistakes make you feel unsafe. So you were in a household where, your importance was very much based on your success. And like doing the right thing is like very, it's like a very prominent thing in your family dynamic. Like, oh, these types of people are wrong, or this behavior is wrong and this is right. That kind of dynamic between parents and children can be really destructive for children, because you develop this arrogance and you don't have compassion towards other people, because there's usually no right and wrong. Like, it's usually a very in between. There are some cases where, like, yes, some things are just flat out wrong, but it's a very small percentage of things. Then we have a fearful avoidant leaning anxious. So these people tend to be overgiving, very open, very present, can often be codependent in relationships. They have really good intentions, and they're loving and they want to be close, but subconsciously they're also pushing that away once they're in that situation. They start to like not trust it or reject it a little bit. And for me, I would say that I like mainly identify as a fearful avoidant leaning anxious. And then when I'm in that like extreme emotional pain, then I start to get into that volatile area. But for the most part, I was really in this fearful avoidant leaning anxious. Then you also have the fearful avoidant leaning dismissive. So you lean avoidant. And they can be open and vulnerable at times, but have a very difficult time expressing their needs. They often had to read between the lines as kids. And then now they bring that into their relationships, and they kind of expect that the other person is going to read between the lines. And if the other person loves them and cares about them, that they will pick up on their subtle cues or their passive aggression, because that's what they did as a kid. That's what they had to do because their caregiver wouldn't express themselves. And as you can see, like I kind of had a little bit of that with my mom. But it didn't kind of push me into this avoidance. It more pushed me anxious. So you have to be really careful if this is you, though, because once again, you're like fantasizing relationships and building them up in a way that isn't realistic. Like, it's not natural for you to think your partner is going to be the best partner for you if they can read your mind. Like, that's pretty much never going to happen. And that's like not really healthy. You want to be in a relationship where you can talk about your feelings and you can work through them. Now let's get into how to navigate relationships with fearful avoidant people. Just want to say really quickly that this isn't an excuse to just like deal with the behavior. You guys should always be working towards becoming secure and securing your attachments, separately. Like you should both be working towards that. Number 1, identify the problem. Point out their behavior gently. This will validate their feelings of needing to be seen or heard. So that is like really important to a fearful avoidant, being seen and heard. So pointing out their behavior, even if you're pointing out bad behavior, like even if you're saying like, hey, you're being kind of critical right now, or hey, you're being kind of passive aggressive, can we talk about why that is? Like that is going to go a really long way with fearful avoidant people, because they're going to see that you're actually noticing how your actions are affecting them. And that's a really important thing. Number 2, talk about getting to the root of how they feel. So when you have these conversations, take the time to be like, where is this coming from? Why is it that you think you feel this way? Because once again, it's really important for a fearful avoidant person to feel deeply understood. Number 3, consistency. I mean, this pretty much is for all relationships, like just kind of sticking to your word and being consistent is going to go a long way, especially though for fearful avoidant people who had a lot of inconsistency in their life as children. Check in regularly, even if things are going okay, just check in and see how someone's doing, and keep that kind of emotional intimacy a little bit higher than usual, and do it to the degree to which you feel good, because it's also about you. I mean, you're in the relationship too, so once again, you're not just doing this to like meet someone else's needs. You have to feel good about it. And the last thing is physical touch or eye contact. These can be little ways of making the person feel seen and feel connected in the relationship or in the friendship. I guess with friendship, it's maybe not all friendships are good with like physical touch in that way, but whatever you feel is good in your connection. It can just be helpful once again to make a fearful avoidant person feel like you really care, and that's important to fearful avoidant people. So guys, I did my best. We went through a lot of symptoms. We went through the types of fearful avoidance, and then we spoke about navigating the relationships, and we spoke a little bit about the causes, and that fearful avoidance is often caused by trauma and abuse, and it's one of the more rare attachment styles. But if you do identify with it, or you think someone does, I hope this video helped you. I hope you resonate with it in some way. If you do, leave a like, leave a comment. Once again, subscribe to the channel. Next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the secure attachment and how you can go about securing your insecure attachment. So hope to see you guys in the next episode. Lots of love, lots of light. See you there.